今回のエミールさんとジョイさんのトーク、せっかくなので英語版と日本語版を作ることにしました。今、あなたが聞いているのは英語版になります。翻訳版を聞きたい方は、ポッドキャストの日本語版をクリックしてみてください。デジタルアーキテクトで千葉工大の学長、伊藤穰一ことジョイさんが、今一番興味のある分野を深掘りしていく、ジョイトースポッドキャスト。本日のお客様は、
Hi, Emile. Thank you for your time today. I'm super excited to have you on my podcast. And we'll talk a lot about how we met and other things, but maybe we can start out with you. Can you introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Joy. It's a big honor to be on your podcast. I'm an international autism advocate from South Africa. I'm the president of the board of directors of ICDL, which is the International Council on Development and Learning. And I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of South Africa, where I do a lot of research on neurodiversity, especially in the Global South. And I represent underrepresented groups on the Commonwealth Disabled Peoples Forum, in which I do self-advocacy and help with the civil rights movement in those specific countries.
Thanks, Emile. And I remember, I think I first heard about you. There was a special issue of Forbes magazine in Japan. And I think our mutual friend, Jeff Gunsel, who is the CEO of ICDL that teaches floor time therapy, which is our favorite therapy method for my daughter. I think he is the one that connected us.
南アフリカを拠点に自閉症当事者として活動を続けるエミール・ガウスさん。フロアタイムの教育機関である ICDL の理事長を務める傍ら、南アフリカでポスドク研究員として様々なリサーチを行っているそうです。今月9月はニューロダイバーシティにとって重要な月。国内では障害者雇用支援月間として様々な取り組みが行われます。一方、海の向こうのアメリカでは、ケネディ厚生長官が公約した自閉症の原因特定の回答期限を迎えます。ダイバーシティ&インクルージョンが揺らぐ今、脳や神経の多様性は今後どこに向かうのでしょうか。
Joito's podcast. The story was amazing. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about what you shared in the magazine about how you got to where you are.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And we are very grateful, myself and Dr. Gunsel from ICDL, for your support and especially the way in which your influence in terms of Forbes Japan. And I must say that we form a mutual connection. And as someone on the autism spectrum, I was diagnosed at the age of 3.5 years. And it was actually a specialist educator that noticed that I portrayed ASD tendencies. I was a non-speaking autistic individual until the age of 15, where I couldn't pronounce any words. I was sensory overloaded in the mainstream education system. There was general frustration in my behavior, and there was a lot of autism tendencies when you look particularly at communication, when you look particularly at sensory overload, and also general frustration in general society with organization and also planning. But it's a long journey. And I always say to parents when I do advocacy that you need to build a solid support system, because the journey is hard, the journey is long, some days. And of course, you can relate to it as well when it comes to your personal lives and so many others, that some days when you look particularly at neurodivergence, you will achieve a lot. You will set specific milestones, but the next day, you will take few steps back in terms of development.
エミールさんは3歳6ヶ月の時に自閉症と診断されました。15歳までは発語が全くなく、常に感覚過敏で、時にメルトダウンを起こしていたそうです。コミュニケーションに困難があり、社会や教育システムに適応できず、 常にフラストレーションを抱えていました。15歳で発語が出るまでの間も、後退と前進を繰り返しながら、長い長い道のりを歩んできました。エミールさんは南アフリカ育ち。アフリカならではの文化や慣習に直面し、ひどく苦しんだことがあったといいます。
Growing up in South Africa, I faced cultural misconceptions. For instance, I felt when you look particularly at the cultural expectations, they referred to a deficit model when you look particularly at my journey. And a lot of isolationism, a lot of discrimination, a lot of victimization that was experienced. And at the stage of my life where I felt that, growing up, although I couldn't verbally express my emotions, I had awareness what was going on around me. There was a misconception that I didn't fit the norm. I need to fit in that particular box. And I was immediately isolated, and exclusion took place in the mainstream school environment. And of course, with the support from my late mom and other intervention that occurred, such as a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, and also a psychologist that assisted me until the age of, I would say, 9 years old. But I was always in a mainstream school environment, and it caused damage. Joey, I remember specifically that I stumbled in class when I was 9 years old, and there was a specialist teacher a teacher that tied up my hands because of my difference. And it contributed a lot towards my mental health challenges that I experienced late in my life. And therefore, with continuous support, I would say after the age of 15, where I could basically say semi-verbal sentences, and it basically accommodated my needs with the additional support that I received. But, it was a long journey. And of course, when you look particularly at the masculine, ableist, and social expectations that an individual is confronted with in different environments, I basically needed to adapt to my circumstances, and it was extremely hard. But it's a long journey, and I'm grateful that I'm here today as a international autism advocate, a autistic husband, a son, and I'm very grateful.
南アフリカでは自閉症当事者に対する差別が激しく、エミールさんは孤立していたといいます。当時は発する言葉を持たなかったエミールさんではありますが、自分の置かれた状況については気づいていました。こうあるべきという社会の枠組みにきちっとはまらない自分のことを学校や社会は排除している、そう理解していたといいます。当時、エミールさんは小学校の通常級に在籍していました。授業中は自己刺激行動、いわゆるスティミングを行っていたエミールさんに対して、学校の指導員は手を縛ってやめさせようとしたといいます。この体験が原因となり、エミールさんは長い間、精神的な問題を抱えることになりました。15歳で発語を獲得してからも、片言な状態が続きました。また、男らしくあることや、普通であることを押し付けられ、適応するのにとても大変な日々を送ったといいます。
So my daughter, as you know, but some people on the podcast may not know, is autistic. She was also diagnosed around 2 or 3, and she's non-speaking. And reading that you were non-speaking until you were 15, and then got a PhD, and now have all of these research and governance positions and doing self-advocacy, I think it gives hope to a lot of people. And I think that's an incredible accomplishment. So first of all, I want to thank you for that. And, I'd love to hear, you shared a little bit about your story, but maybe can you share how you got into the self-advocacy and maybe tell us a little bit about the self-advocacy work?
Joey, it's actually a very interesting story. And I must say that autism self-advocacy basically gave me a lot of opportunities, but it came at a very dark place that I personally experienced in my life. As a non-speaking autistic individual, as I mentioned previously, it was very hard, to fit into university and any formal education system. And that contributed towards my mental health challenges in terms of the social isolationism that I experienced and the continuous discrimination in public sectors that I experienced in the public and also generally. And it contributed to my mental health challenges as I referred to myself based on my knowledge, and this was before I did self-advocacy when I was in my honors, going from my honors into my master's degree, that I felt that I judged myself according to the deficit model, where I felt that there was something wrong with my challenges. I couldn't understand why I was non-speaking till the age of 15 and why I was semi-verbal until the age of, I would say, 25. And I must say now I'm in my 7th or 8th year of speaking now fluently as I speak today. But it was very long. But the continuous discrimination that I experienced in different settings contributed to my mental health challenge, where I felt one day, a couple of years ago, where I felt that the world isn't built for someone like me. And I decided I considered to trying to commit suicide, where I took 7 or 8 sleeping tablets. And I was immediately rushed to hospital, and I was in a psychiatric ward for 2 weeks, where I received a therapy, where I talked about my personal experiences and also my mental health. And as I was speaking to the psychologist and the therapist, they recommended that why don't I use autism self-advocacy to improve my own self-confidence, to contribute towards society, because my mental health was at a low point in my life, and they recommended that I do self-advocacy. And my philosophy always with autism self-advocacy, and even today as well, is that if I can inspire 1 or 2 families, then it's all worth it. And eventually I connected with a local organization that represents neurodivergent individuals in South Africa. And we started communicating, and I had a meeting with them, and they recommended that I speak in front of a parent group one Saturday. Basically, after speaking, I started feeling good about myself again, that there was a sudden purpose. And eventually my self-advocacy grew bigger, where I started to speak at the provincial or the state, here in South Africa, state's national education department's autism advocacy campaign. And eventually that grew bigger, where I spoke at international on national conferences. And that is where I met my wife and my carer / mother-in-law, Malkin, was very special to us, and we started communicating. And eventually I started getting involved with these small initiatives until in 2019, where I got an email where I was asked to represent South Africa at the United Nations at the Congress of State Parties event. And they wanted me to give a speech on the state of autism self-advocacy in South Africa, and especially what self-advocates in South Africa are confronted with on a daily basis. And I gave my speech at the Commonwealth side meeting, and eventually that is where I got elected after my presentation on the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum, which represents disabled people in 55 different countries, and I represent neurodiversity. And that is also a couple of years later, a year later, that is also where my connection with ICDL came, where I was always familiar with the approach, as I was a young child that received floor time from an occupational therapist who engaged with me as well. And when I familiarized myself with floor time, I basically saw two connections and eventually I came on the board as well. But let me tell you, Joy, to conclude what I'm trying to say to you is that autism self-advocacy gave me a lot of opportunities. It benefited my life tremendously, building my self-confidence. It basically gave my life a purpose. I met my family and it gave me also job opportunities. And especially when it comes to ICDL and meeting influential figures like you in the world, I benefited from that. But it came from a very dark place.
And, I think the mental health issues around people with autism around the world is an issue, but maybe, I know you've talked about statistics and things like that, but can you talk a little bit about what the cause of the mental health issues is? Is it really the outside perception, or is it different? And I guess, is it, do you think it's, you go around the world talking about this, is it particularly bad in South Africa? Because I know US is more advanced than Japan, for instance, in self-advocacy. And one of the issues is, I think, around things to try to prevent mental health issues. But maybe you can share a little bit about the state of the world and kind of what's maybe different in South Africa. I have a feeling Japan may be similar to South Africa in many ways.
ここでジョイさんから質問が投げかけられました。自閉症の人々のメンタルヘルスの問題は大きな課題となっています。この原因は偏見や差別にあるのでしょうか？それとも別の要因があるのでしょうか？南アフリカの状況は世界と比べたときにどのようなものなのでしょうか？見る限り当事者運動は日本よりも進んでいるように見えますが、当事者を取り巻く環境は日本と似ているような気がしますが、どうなんでしょうか？
There's a lot of similarities, Joy, and one of the things that I've noticed in my research, and I need to put on my research cap at the moment, because my advocacy is based firstly on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and in which we also do self-advocacy on our Facebook page called Special Need Cafe. But I came to realize that the autism spectrum stays the same throughout the world. We've got similar challenges. But what makes it different is our experiences in terms of the different socioeconomic circumstances of the country, the education, of course, and also the unemployment rate and other factors as well. Let me share with you a couple of statistics to start off. The mental health challenges, especially in the global south, in low to middle income countries, especially in Africa, are widespread, urgent, and often invisible. They are deeply rooted in socioeconomic inequalities, historic injustices, stigma, and a lack of infrastructure, and the neglect of psychosocial well-being as a priority in these specific countries. In South Africa, we've got the highest suicide rate of neurodivergent individuals in the world. And of course, I can speak about it because I can relate to it as I was there at that stage. The living age of a neurodiverse individual in South Africa is 35 years old due to, again, based on my personal experiences, discrimination, victimization, unemployment, and a lack of support from families as well. In South Africa, for instance, or in the continent of Africa, rather, we've got a lot of cultural differences, as any country has, that contribute to the different perceptions towards neurodiversity.
そして、エミールさんから西アフリカで続く衝撃的な慣習についても知らされることになりました。
To give you an example, there's factors like filicide in West Africa. And I saw it personally years ago in Rwanda, where parents in the local villages will decide to keep the child or to kill the child based on the perceptions from society. Also based on the perceptions of the community and the family as well, and the pressure that the family puts on that individual. So religion plays a very big part. And in some cases, there's a belief that neurodiversity is a curse, and there's something wrong with the individual. But the biggest problem that we have in general society and all over the world is education in general. When you particularly at understanding what neurodivergent is, understanding the capabilities of the individual, and also general acceptance of the society. Joy, I've got a philosophy when it comes to the advocacy in the world, and especially neurodiversity. And based on the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and in South Africa, we've got the white paper, but we've got a problem between policy compliance versus policy reliance. You can have the best policies in the world when it comes to neurodiversity and general disabilities, but it's a choice not to include an individual. Reasonable accommodation is not a privilege, it's a right. And unfortunately, based on a lack of education and a lack of understanding in society, that is where the biggest problem lies. And that's why we advocate. And I always say there's various factors that contribute towards the mental health challenges. And therefore, like I said to you in the beginning, that it's often invisible because that is the most underestimating factor in neurodiversity. And I always say that you can accommodate what you see, but if you can't see, if you do not see, that is where you start judging, and that is where you start to understand, why this individual acts or reacts in that specific way. So education is extremely important. That is what we are currently lacking in general.
ジョイさんとエミールさんのお話はまだまだ続きます。続きが気になる方はお聞きのプラットフォームで番組登録をお願いします。ジョイさんと落合陽一さんによるニューロダイバーシティ×イノベーション特別対談、ニューロダイバーシティパラダイムの未来と実践が11月10日月曜日に麻布台ヒルズで開催されます。このイベントには元国連職員でニューロダイバーシティ協会顧問の尾形里美さんも研修セッションに登壇します。国際的な現場経験を生かした実践的なワークショップも実施予定。チケットや詳細は落合陽一、伊藤穰一、ニューロダイバーシティパラダイムの未来と実践で検索。または PTEX イベントページをご覧ください。番組では NFT を無料でプレゼントしています。ご希望の方は特設サイトにて次の問題の答えを入力してください。エミールさんが理事長を務める団体の名前は何だったでしょうか？略称を大文字半角英数字でお答えください。サイトのリンクは番組詳細欄に記載しています。また、変革コミュニティのメンバーは答えをお店サイトで入力してください。正解された方には100変革をプレゼントします。
デジタルガレージは危険な海に最初に飛び込むファーストペンギンスピリットを創業以来大事にし続けています。これから来る Web3 オープンソース時代を見据えたテクノロジーで新たなビジネスを生み出す仲間を募集しています。番組詳細欄にあるリンクよりぜひご覧ください。
Web3 is here. Join us. Join the first penguins.
New Context Designer, Digital Garage.